All right, joining me is Matthew Sigel, head of digital assets research at VanEck, who's a top 10 ETF issuer and one who is heavily immersed in crypto. So they offer several digital asset related ETFs, including both spot Bitcoin and spot Ether ETFs. They have an ETF holding the stocks of companies involved in businesses such as digital asset exchanges and miners. And not only that, they have a filing with the SEC for a spot Salana ETF. And I suspect, I know Matthew can't comment on this, but I suspect we're going to see some additional crypto ETF filings from VanEck at some point. But Matthew is somebody who I would say, certainly within the ETF space, but I would say just the industry overall, there are very few people I come across with the depth of crypto knowledge that he has. And so, Matthew, thank you for joining me.
Great to be here, Nate. Thanks.
All right, so I just mentioned that Solana ETF filing, and don't worry, I'm not going to ambush you with that right off the bat. I know you can't really speak to that, though. I will say I might come back and ask you about some of the other crypto ETF filings more generally here in a bit. But Matthew, I bring that up because that filing and obviously the entire crypto ecosystem is going to be impacted by this election we just witnessed, where Donald Trump won rather easily. If you look at the Senate, that's going to be controlled by Republicans. As we sit here today, it's possible Republicans also control the House. We'll see. But of course, during the Trump campaign, we certainly heard much more of a pro-crypto posture. And so I love to start there. You know, we're not even 48 hours removed from the election results, but I'd love to hear your initial take and how you think this election could impact crypto as we sit here today.
Yeah, it's been a great week for Bitcoin and crypto, a total rebuke of the current administration's regulatory stance towards this asset class. Thankfully, we nailed the election call, predicted pretty early on that Trump was going to win, and saw some signs out of the early counties reporting in Georgia at 7 p.m. that it was going to go a certain way. So bought some more crypto asset securities, as the regulator calls them. I think those may disappear, actually. They may not exist anymore in 6 months or so. And you know, my own personal view is that you don't take profits here unless you need to feed yourself or shelter yourself with the money. So the tokens that specifically are the subject of SEC lawsuits, DeFi and staking tokens like Uniswap and Lido, saw the biggest performance. That's what we expected. And just generally, altcoins, meaning non-Bitcoin, have kind of strengthened their lead in the last couple of days. And just to your point on the Solana ETF, you know, our S1 is still live. And Jan VanEck said the day after the election, he told product development to sharpen their pencils and get back to work on new products. So we are quite optimistic that this is going to change the tone in the US and that there'll be more builders, entrepreneurs, and eventually, you know, asset managers who get involved in the space.
How quickly do you think we could see the wind shift here? You know, I think you and I would both agree that longer term, the right answer is to have a comprehensive bipartisan crypto regulatory framework in place. I think that's what the industry wants. But how quickly do you think we could see things start to shift?
Yeah, it'll be curious to see like how long the corpse keeps flapping here. I noticed there was some updates in SEC actions against crypto even this morning. You know, I think the base case is that Trump will, you know, demote Gary Gendler on day one. Then he may or may not leave, and maybe it takes a couple of quarters to see, you know, actual movement in terms of new products. But the market's going to take its cue from the rhetoric and the personnel. And if you kind of wait for the reality, maybe you're even setting yourself up for a disappointment trade. So that's why our conviction is quite strong here for the next couple months.
You mentioned SEC Chairman Gary Gensler. It was well documented. This was several months ago that Donald Trump said he would fire Gensler on day one. And we'll see what happens. But Any sense as to who the new chair of the SEC might be? I've heard Robinhood Chief Legal Officer Dan Gallagher. I've heard his name floated around. There are some others out there, but any initial thoughts on that?
Yeah, he's been mentioned most often. There was that Politico story a couple of weeks. Obviously, Robinhood has a very compelling crypto offering, and it's grown into a meaningful part of their business. And with Dan as a former SEC commissioner, he has the right resume to step in on day one. I'm kind of watching Treasury Secretary a little more closely than SEC chair because I think the Republican mainstream is pretty on board with just reversing everything that the SEC has done for the last 4 years, whereas Treasury Secretary, there's a bit more import and more nuance even for Bitcoin. I think Brian Brooks and Chris Giancarlo are both going to play roles in this industry. Brian Brooks, former OCC head, who kind of paved the way for some good custody offerings on his way out the door. I know a lot of crypto fans would love to see SEC Commissioner Hester Pierce as potential chair. She has ruled it out. Her term expires next year, and she's ruled it out. But I'm going to say that Republican control of the Senate by this much, you may see some pretty wild card appointments by the president because he's really got the confirmations in the bag. So, maybe there's a wild card there, and she stays. Yeah.
How impactful is that? So, you have a unique perch there at VanEck. You've been closely involved in numerous ETF filings. How much can an SEC chairman or the composition of the SEC with the commissioners, how much can that really impact something like crypto ETF filings? Can you offer some context on that?
Yeah, it matters a great deal. So for plain vanilla ETFs, if you want to make another FANG ETF, the SEC staff handles those applications under something called delegated authority, which requires no vote from the commissioners. But for certain ETFs that are novel or complex or raise new regulatory issues that the commissioners think might establish new precedent, then there is a full vote by the commission. And under a Democratic president, there'd be 3 Democrat commissioners and 2 Republicans. So there's been kind of no way to overcome Gary Gensler's objections over the last 4 years. And you can see that how much sway that the commissioner has in how the Bitcoin futures ETFs came to light, where it was a Gary Gensler speech that signaled that the SEC would be open for business. So it's very important, and we think it's going to change dramatically once he's out.
Let me ask you this. I want to spend most of our time looking forward, so I don't want to spend a lot of time looking backwards, but I'm curious how frustrating the regulatory environment around crypto has been for you and VanEck over the past several years. Again, Matthew, you've had a front row seat. I'm just curious, what has that been like from your perspective?
Uh, Honestly, it's just made me sad for America to kind of lose our lead in innovation. So I think that's going to change. But to be specific, it's very unfair to sue people for breaking rules that have not been written, and then to decline to comment on the specifics when you're asked in front of Congress. Nobody can plan under that type of framework. So the SEC either has to go through the typical rulemaking process, which is what Gary Gensler got sanctioned for, and eventually SAB 121 was overturned by Congress, or you have to follow Congress's lead. And the current SEC and Gary Gensler did neither. So just starting with no longer suing people proactively, that is going to be a huge difference for the industry. And just getting back to the bread and butter of investigating actual credible complaints of fraud, rather than inviting projects in, asking them a bunch of questions about their business, and then hitting them with some enforcement suit where the rules are not clear. on the ETF side, it's been frustrating because we were the first to file for both first traditional ETF manager to file for both Bitcoin and Ethereum ETFs, and the regulator chose to let all of the issuers go together. In the long run, that's a very sad world, also in my view, where kind of one large organization gets to piggyback on all the great ideas that the smaller guys have. That's not really American way. Look forward to getting back to the usual first come, first serve approach to approving ETFs.
When you think about the crypto industry overall, I've talked a lot about how there's a balance between crypto innovation and regulation, right? Where very simply, I view those two as a balancing act. In that, I don't think you can just have unchecked innovation, because I do think people can get hurt financially, right? I think there have to be some basic guardrails in place. But on the other hand, you obviously can't overregulate, or else you stunt innovation. And when I look back over the past several years, really to what you were just saying, I feel like we've clearly been in an environment where we've been way out of balance on the regulatory side. It's been way too heavy of a hand on regulation. My question for you is, how do you view that balance? Like, in a perfect world moving forward, how would you like to see politicians and regulators, work that balancing act?
I think the consensus answer to that question is to express excitement that a stablecoin bill may be passed next year, and perhaps a more comprehensive market structure legislation that lays out, what is a security, what is a commodity, what are the characteristics of decentralization, how can we define it, what would the regulatory disclosure be if a certain token is a security under those rules. I have a slightly different take. I know there's a lot of optimism around FIT21 and the stablecoin bill. Personally, I'm not satisfied with either of those bills. I think that given the red wave, they deserve a complete rewrite. FIT21, as it's written, is quite bad for DeFi. It basically makes issuers and exchanges collect the personal information from users to ensure that they're not spending X% of their income or Y% of their assets on these early stage projects. I think that would be quite bad for DeFi, because it's impossible for these DeFi exchanges to collect that personal information. And on the stablecoin bill, even the rewritten draft by Haggerty, it still makes state chartered banks get Fed permission to issue these stablecoins. And that's a break with precedent. And in my view, the academic justification for it is very flimsy. It's one of these cases of kind of academic information laundering that Elizabeth Warren is so good at, where you take one study and then recycle that through the Wall Street Journal until it gets accepted as doctrine, and then people are testifying in front of Congress about it. That's what Lena Khan did with her Yale book report on antitrust, and she lost most of her cases over the last 4 years. So this academic paper, Taming Wildcat Stablecoins, it was cited in the Treasury report last week. That was, in my opinion, pretty negative for DeFi. And they're using one era of American history to claim that private money is bad. And they're ignoring a lot of the innovation that we've had since then. Information no longer travels by Pony Express. There's plenty of countries where private money did work. So I think we can rewrite some of these bills and make them even more market friendly. And what I would see in a perfect world is just re-index some of these suspicious transaction limits to inflation. These SARs, suspicious activity reports, the currency transaction reports that banks have to file, 5K, 10K limits that haven't been changed since 1970. The travel rule, $3K, $3,000, hasn't been changed since 1966. They're going lower on that in the EU. So these are existential battles, but just starting with a precedent of not micromanaging everyone's financial transactions when the world has shown it can't properly manage the current banking system, would be my vote. And that's commonly summarized as safe harbor.
Before we move on, because I do want to ask you about some specific crypto assets, do you have any personal views as to why the Biden-Harris administration and a Gensler-led SEC did take such a hostile approach towards the crypto industry? Because I was just talking about this balance between regulation and innovation, and I share your view in that. I think we have ceded a leadership position here in the U.S. To other countries, at least for the time being, and we are behind. And I'm just curious, I would like to think our politicians wake up and think about how we can push the country forward and push innovation forward. Again, understanding that we need to have some basic guardrails in place. But just any personal views as to why the administration has been so hostile or was so hostile towards crypto over the past 4 years or so?
Yeah, the mechanics of it are that Biden issued and signed an executive order in March of 2022 that instructed all the federal agencies to look at crypto from the perspective of enforcement and consumer protection more than innovation. So that gave the cover for the agencies to go after the industry. And the underlying question of why they did that, in my personal view, is that many of the policies that kind of the current mainstream Democrat parties are advocating for is one of micromanagement of many aspects of our lives, and the financial system is one of them. And as social media and finance have kind of come closer together, the capital formation process is so instantaneous that a meme can actually become money. And I think that if you want to try to micromanage the economy, then you're offended by that kind of spontaneous combustion of capital formation. You want to have your pulse on it because, to your point, some percentage of it is going to be fraudulent or dishonest. And finding that balance, I'm not saying it's easy, but I think what we saw from the vote is most people think it's swung too far.
It's interesting because, the narrative, if you go back, say, 10 years ago or so, was just this concern that maybe something like Bitcoin would be a threat to the US dollar. And that narrative was planted early on. And in my view, this is really a basic take, was that politicians got that in their head, and then they basically took that narrative and attributed it to everything happening in the crypto sphere, that there was some sort of threat, that crypto was viewed as just this threat to the status quo and to the dollar and to everything else in place, and we just have not been able to shake that. I don't know if you have any comments on that. Again, very basic take. I just feel like that narrative has carried through for a long time now.
I think that narrative is largely correct. I think crypto is a threat to the status quo and the dollar, the status quo being the kind of financial intermediaries who take 6-7% of global GDP, and it's often unclear what value is returned to regular working people. And then in terms of the dollar, these are 20,000 different cryptocurrencies. They all have their own monetary policy. Bitcoin's is kind of the most simple and hard to change. So it's maybe the biggest threat to the dollar, but they are all alternative forms of money to fiat. And it's rational why some regulators would push back on that.
All right. So with our remaining time and sort of a good segue here, I think you'll like this. I was trying to come up with a fun concept for you. And I believe I've been trying to make a concerted effort to cover crypto basics on this podcast because I've learned, Matthew, I'm sure you see this all the time, that even people who say they know crypto, I have learned that they can't always articulate some of this in a manner that everyone can understand. And so I want to make sure I always have that as a guiding light on this podcast, just making sure we always cover the basics. And so what I would love to do with you, if you're up for it, I'd love to just go rapid fire through several crypto assets and just have you offer some basics, perhaps how you view the investment case. Are you up for that?
I will do it.
All right, good. Okay, so let's just start with the obvious one, Bitcoin. And very simply, I'll just ask you, how do you like to explain what this is? And how do you like to explain what the basic investment case is?
Bitcoin is a bet against the credibility of central bankers to maintain the purchasing power of their fiat. The vast majority of government-issued fiat currencies generally fall 99% over a reasonable time frame, and Bitcoin being fixed in supply and accessible to anybody in the world with an internet connection. It offers an alternative for countries who are struggling to maintain the value of their currency. And Bitcoin's linkage to energy, the fact that it requires real world assets to create, makes it a very honest arbiter of value. So we are increasingly seeing countries around the world. There's now 7 different countries that are mining Bitcoin using government resources, and they're doing that to try to circumvent dollar dominance, or even to just restore some negotiating leverage in their own kind of geopolitical positioning.
I think it was last week I happened to catch you on CNBC, and I don't know if you want to talk at all about this or any price predictions, but I saw a pretty, I'll call it remarkable price forecast for Bitcoin. I believe it was by 2050. Do you want to talk about that at all? This certainly caught my attention.
Yeah, so we do think that eventually Bitcoin is going to be used as a settlement currency for global trade, and it will also be held by global central banks. Global central banks have a more than 15% weighting to gold. And if you look at what the BRICS countries are saying, specifically Russia, there was a large BRICS conference last week. There's a number of new members to BRICS this year, and 3 of them are mining Bitcoin with government resources. And Russia has indicated that their sovereign wealth fund is making investments to incentivize Bitcoin mining infrastructure across the BRICS with an eye towards using it as a settlement currency in global trade. So we tried to look out a couple of decades, think about a time when Putin might be dead, when the world looks to reintegrate Russia and BRICS into the world financial system, and wondering if they're trading with each other with Bitcoin and we're not, that's an unlikely scenario. So if we assume that global central banks have a 2% weighting to Bitcoin, and that 10% of global trade is denominated in Bitcoin, we get to a base case of a $3 million price target by 2050. And before everyone freaks out, that's a 16% CAGR, 1/6. There's plenty of stocks that have done that over a 2-decade period. I mean, it's not hundreds, but it's a handful, and we think Bitcoin has that kind of intangible brand value that it will endure for quite some time.
Okay, so that's Bitcoin. Let's move on and talk about Ether. And I guess same question here. How would you explain this to a layman? And I'm sure you've seen there's this narrative out there that Bitcoin is something that's very easy for people to get their head around. You see the digital gold narrative, so on and so forth. But Ether, the narrative is it's much harder to explain. So I'm curious how you would explain Ether, and then again, just the high level investment case here.
Sure. So all of these cryptos are databases. This is database software. But instead of running the database at Amazon Web Services, you're running it across thousands or tens of thousands of distributed computers. So with that context, Ether is an open source app store. And instead of setting up your app within the Apple App Store or on Google Play, you're setting it up on top of Ethereum, and you have access to this decentralized database. So nobody at Google or Amazon can tell you that you're selling an offensive product and kick you off. No one can steal your funds. And because of the architecture of the Ethereum blockchain, you are able to program automated transactions into this app store. So you can create a bunch of if A, then B functionality that is not possible with Bitcoin. And that can open up eventually many of the same Web 2 use cases, but running on this distributed database. And the only way that you can set up one of these storefronts or purchase something or participate in the network is if you use the token Ethereum as your means of payment. So in that sense, you get a circular economy. It's a very reflexive asset, but that's the base case. Open source app store.
And then just in terms of the investment case itself, I'm not looking for any sort of price prediction, but just how do you think about that at a very high level?
Yeah, Ethereum is one of the very small handful of crypto tokens where the token actually has some value because of the way that it's been designed. As the users are paying fees to use the Ethereum blockchain, set up a storefront, accept payments, send payments, a portion of those user gas fees are uh, are used to buy back and burn the Ethereum token, removing it from circulation and creating this deflationary impact on the currency, which helps it to retain its value. So we use a discounted cash flow and look at what type of fees users are paying, how much of that gets returned to token holders, how we think that may evolve over time, and then just making a forecast over a number of years.
Okay, let me give you a few other crypto assets here. I'm going to go Solana next. And perhaps you can just compare and contrast this with Ether, because I always see a lot of back and forth on X. I'm sure you do as well, with people arguing over this. Just tell us about Solana.
It is going after the exact same market as Ethereum, open source app store with the ability to write automated functions into your storefront. It is not quite as decentralized as Ethereum, but it offers much faster performance. So those are trade-offs that people are frankly still trying to figure out how to value. And because of that, we recommend owning both. But when we value it, we use much the same formula that we use for Ethereum. It's a similar model where the token itself is needed to perform transactions, and then a portion of those user fees get returned to token holders who agree to stake or lock up their tokens.
On a longer term time horizon, do you see Ether and Solana as an either or do you think both can coexist longer term?
That's really the gazillion dollar question here. We've seen from the Web 2 world that certain verticals get highly concentrated, whether it's internet search or commerce. I think it's unclear whether it's going to be one player who takes 80% or three players who take 50 to 60%. There's a lot of precedent for both of those models. We have pretty strong conviction that ETH and Sol would be among those survivors, but it really is too early to say.
Do you have any concerns regarding Sol's centralization or decentralization and lack thereof? I hear that tossed around too in comparison to Ether. Any quick thoughts on that?
From a practical perspective, the Solana blockchain has performed very, very well for about 10 months now with basically no downtime. And that's because of a number of kind of small, they would dispute that, medium-sized innovations that have occurred on the code base. Where there's really room for improvement is that on Solana, there's still kind of only one software client that the node operators can run, but there's another one that's very close to wide release, and that should do a lot for the perceived resiliency of the network. The actual resiliency over the last 9-10 months has been very good, but that second client should provide a very compelling backup for Solana.
Okay, two others I'll ask you about real quick. You can just give me a 30-second take on these if you'd like. And I'm not sure if you actually think there's an investment case with either of these. I sort of assumed you had an investment case with the other three just because VanEck offers spot ETFs, obviously on Bitcoin and Ether, and you have the filing on Solana. But let me ask you about these other two, since I have seen other ETF issuers file for ETFs on these. So first, XRP. What is this, and what's the potential investment case, if any?
Yeah, so first let me just give a little background on how we decide like what ETFs to issue. We want internal conviction in the investment case. We want customer demand, and we need stakeholder buy-in. So all the counterparties that perform the plumbing of an ETF. So on XRP, we just haven't gotten that kind of confluence of conviction. It is a very well-funded project. They've been able to do great work fighting the SEC on that lawsuit, but they kind of missed the boat on stablecoins, and we don't see much differentiation or real participation from the open source community on building new apps on XRP. And that's one of the primary things we're looking for is, are there a lot of developers, database developers, that are excited about building in that programming environment? XRP just hasn't found that differentiation in our view.
Okay, and then the other one I'll ask you about again, just because I've seen ETF filings on this, is Litecoin. So what do you think about that crypto asset?
Yeah, Litecoin is a kind of a mini Bitcoin. It's a proof of work coin with slightly faster block times, so it's a little bit more performant than Bitcoin. But just a public service announcement: the Litecoin founder sold all of his coins at the top in 2017, and that's another one where we just don't see developers who want to build on top of Litecoin. So I'd call it kind of one of those ghost chains.
Okay, fair enough. And then real quick before I let you go, and this obviously is not investment advice from your perspective, is there maybe one other crypto asset that has you intrigued? Maybe something that isn't on the radar of a lot of investors, especially, I would say, the TradFi crowd. Is there something that you're tracking that has you pretty interested?
Yes. So I'd say I'm going to give you two, because there's two sectors within crypto where we are starting to see some good momentum. The first is on physical networks that are tokenized, whether it's a cell phone network like Helium is doing, or a mapping network like HiveMapper, where VanEck has disclosed that we have an investment. It's a competitor to Google Maps, where you mount a dash cam in your car, and then you get paid these tokens for mapping your environment. And then any business that wants to license that mapping API, much like Uber and Airbnb will license the Google Maps API, they can do that from HiveMapper, but they have to use these honey tokens. HiveMapper's now mapped more than 15% of the world's mappable kilometers. It's a super interesting project. And then the other one is in the gaming space. We just disclosed that we made an investment in Off the Grid, which is a Gonzilla Games shooting game. It's on the Avalanche blockchain. It's when one of the bigger mass market shooter game releases in the last couple months. People playing it, might not even know it's crypto, but that's the type of innovation that we're seeing in this space. It takes a couple of years to build one of these AAA games. A lot of that investment was made in 21, 22. We're starting to see the games come to market now. They look pretty good.
I love it, and hopefully with the changes we've seen here recently on the political front, we're going to see a lot more innovation in the crypto space. But Matthew, such a fun conversation this week. I really appreciate you covering the basics there at the end as well. I just don't ever want to take those for granted. So thank you for that. But excellent perspective on the political and regulatory front. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Nate.
That was Matthew Sigel, head of digital assets research at VanEck. I really hope everyone enjoyed this week's episode of Crypto Prime. Please be sure to leave a review or give us a like wherever you're listening or watching. I always appreciate that. And again, I'll be right back here next week with another fantastic guest.
Crypto Prime is hosted by Nate Geraci, president of OTR Media LLC. Nate is also president of the investment advisory firm The ETF Store. While OTR Media LLC and the ETF Store are related by common ownership, they are separate and distinct entities, and anything discussed on this program should not be construed as an official statement by the ETF Store. This program is for informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice. Investing in crypto assets involves substantial risk, including the potential loss of principal. Any past performance figures discussed are not necessarily indicative of future results. Visit CryptoPrimePodcast.com for more information.